My name is Stella Fisher. I am 34 years old. 7 years ago, my parents pushed me into marrying Brandon Hayes, even though they had quietly learned about his mounting financial troubles and gambling habit, all so they could keep tighter strings on my grandmother's estate and make sure the money stayed under their influence. They spent the following years gaslighting me every time I pushed back, reminding me how ungrateful I was for the life they had given me. Now here I am, 7 months pregnant in a Wichita hospital room after a sudden bleeding scare that had everyone rushing me in, and my mother just placed a thick folder on the bedside tray and said in that calm, venomous tone that she and my father had arranged everything at the fertility clinic, including the donor switch, because it was the only way to guarantee I would finally listen and sign the trust papers over to them. My stomach dropped, but something colder and sharper took its place. I was done letting them rewrite my life. If you have ever felt your own parents turn your biggest life moment into their personal chess game, hit that like button and tell me in the comments what part of the country you are watching from right now. I read every single one, and it helps more than you know. The nurse, Leah Rogers, had just stepped out to get the doctor when my mother slid the folder closer. My father stood by the window with his arms crossed, not quite looking at me. My mother's voice stayed even like she was discussing the weather. "We did this for the family, Stella. You were never going to manage that money properly on your own. The clinic owed us a favor after all the donations your father made over the years. We made sure the right donor was used, so the baby would have the right bloodline. It's insurance. Now you sign the papers, and we keep everything safe." My mouth went dry. The folder contained copies of emails, payment receipts totaling $38,000, and a note from the embryologist confirming the switch. My parents had gone behind my back during the second IVF cycle, paid off staff at the clinic we had chosen together, and replaced Brandon's sample with one from a donor they had handpicked. Not because Brandon was infertile like we had been told, but because they wanted leverage. They wanted the baby to be their project, their claim on the $1,900,000 trust my grandmother had left specifically for me. I stared at the papers until the words blurred. My mother kept talking, her words laced with that familiar mix of sweetness and steel. "You have always been so dramatic about independence. Remember when you wanted to move to Denver for that job? We stopped that nonsense too. This is the same thing. You owe us, sweetheart, after everything we sacrificed raising you and your sister." My father cleared his throat and forced a short, awkward laugh, the kind that never reached his eyes. "Martha, maybe we ease up a little. She just had a scare." But the laugh died fast, and he changed the subject immediately to the hospital parking validation, like that would defuse anything. Typical. He never directly contradicted her in front of me, but I knew later he would pull me aside and try the softer version of the same pressure. I felt my hands start to shake on the thin hospital blanket. 7 months of feeling the baby kick of believing this pregnancy was finally the fresh start Brandon and I needed after years of trying, and now this. My mother had orchestrated the entire thing using guilt and money the way she always had. My sister Ivy had known too, apparently. She had helped pick the donor because Ivy has better instincts about these things, my mother said with a small smile. The door opened and Dr. Hazel Rogers walked in, her face tight. She had been the one to order the extra tests after the bleeding started. She glanced at the folder on the tray, and her expression changed. "Mrs. Fisher, I need to speak with Stella privately for a moment." My mother didn't move. Dr. Rogers added, "Now please." My father touched my mother's elbow, and they finally stepped into the hallway, but I saw my mother's mouth tighten in that way that promised this conversation was far from over. Alone with the doctor, I asked the only question that mattered. "Did they really do this?" Dr. Rogers nodded, once her voice low. "The nurse on the case, Leah's sister, actually came to me last week after she saw your file. Your parents approached the clinic months ago. They framed it as protecting the family legacy, paid to make sure the records would support their narrative later if you ever tried to fight the trust changes." "I'm sorry, Stella. This is way beyond unethical." I pressed my hand to my belly and felt the baby move strong and steady. That small kick grounded me. I thanked the doctor and asked her to keep the conversation quiet for now. When my parents came back in, my mother picked up right where she left off, her voice dropping into that disappointed tone she had perfected over decades. "We are not the villains here. You have always made everything harder than it needs to be. Sign the documents tonight, and we will handle the rest. The trust, the house your grandmother left, everything will stay in the family where it belongs. Your sister Ivy is already helping us review the investments. My father shifted his weight and suddenly asked about the hospital cafeteria menu, a clumsy attempt to steer the talk away. It didn't work. My mother shot him a look and he went quiet again. I could see the pattern so clearly now. My mother delivered the blows, my father deflected or softened just enough to keep the peace, and together they wore me down until I gave in. They had done it my whole life, from college choices to the wedding to this pregnancy. I told them I needed time to think. My mother's smile was thin. Of course, dear, but the bleeding scare today should remind you how fragile things are. You need family around you. We already spoke to Brandon. He agrees this is the responsible choice. The words landed like a slap. Brandon had known. Or at least he was being pressured too. I didn't ask. I just nodded and waited for them to leave. Later that night, after the monitors showed the baby was stable, my best friend Nova King slipped into the room carrying coffee she wasn't supposed to bring. Nova had been warning me for months that my parents' sudden interest in the pregnancy felt off. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened while I whispered the whole story. Her face went pale. Stella, this is bigger than guilt tripping. They committed fraud. You need to call someone who isn't family. I thought about my uncle Mason Bennett, my mother's brother, who had always been the one quiet voice of reason in family gatherings. He lived 2 streets over in our Wichita neighborhood. Maybe he could help. Nova offered to text him right then. I said yes. While we waited for his reply, I stared at the folder my mother had left behind. Every page was another piece of proof that my parents had treated my body, my marriage, and my future child like assets to be managed. The next morning, the bleeding had stopped, and they discharged me with strict bed rest instructions. My parents were waiting in the lobby, my mother already holding the trust paperwork in a neat leather folder. My father stood a step behind her, checking his phone like the whole scene bored him. We can take you straight to the lawyer's office, my mother said brightly. Grayson King is expecting us at 10. He drew up the new power of attorney language last week. I felt the familiar weight of obligation settle on my chest, the same weight that had kept me quiet for years. But this time, it was heavier because it wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the baby. My mother leaned in and added her voice soft but edged. You wouldn't want to risk another scare by stressing yourself out fighting this, would? You think of the baby. Think of what you owe the family that raised you. Uncle Mason's text came through then. He was already on his way to the hospital parking lot, and he wanted to talk privately before I signed anything. I told my parents I needed to use the restroom first. Instead, I slipped out a side door and met Mason by his truck. He looked tired, like he had been up all night. Your mother called me yesterday bragging about how they fixed the fertility issue for you. I didn't believe her until I saw the bank transfers she accidentally copied me on. Stella, this is illegal. You don't have to do this. For the first time in months, I felt a crack in the wall my parents had built around me. Mason offered to connect me with a private investigator. He knew Violet Thompson, who specialized in financial fraud cases. He said she could pull the full paper trail quietly. I hugged him hard and promised I would call her that afternoon. When I walked back inside, my mother was waiting, arms crossed, her expression the same one she used when I was 16 and tried to skip a family dinner. Where were you? We don't have all day. My father stood beside her, offering a weak smile that didn't hide the tension in his jaw. I told them I needed 24 hours to rest at home before any meetings. My mother's laugh was short and sharp. 24 hours turns into 24 days with you. Fine. But if anything happens to that baby because you're being stubborn, remember who warned you. The drive home with Brandon was silent until we pulled into our driveway in the quiet Wichita subdivision. He finally spoke, voice low. Your parents said it was the only way to protect the inheritance for the kid. I didn't know the full details until last week. I didn't answer. I just went inside, locked myself in the nursery we had half painted, and called Violet Thompson. She answered on the first ring and agreed to meet me at a coffee shop near my office the next morning. That night, my sister Ivy stopped by unannounced, carrying a casserole like it was a peace offering. She sat at my kitchen table and said exactly what my mother had coached her to say. You're making this so much harder than it has to be, Stella. Mom and Dad only want what is best. Sign the papers and we can all move on. The trust will pay for everything the baby needs. Her words were softer than my mother's, but the message was identical. I felt the walls closing in again. The guilt, the obligation, the constant reminder that I had never quite measured up to the daughter they wanted. Ivy left after I promised to think about it. Alone in the dark, I stared at the ultrasound photo on the fridge and made a quiet promise to the baby. Whatever happened next, I would not let my parents turn this child into their next bargaining chip. The following morning, I met Violet at the coffee shop. She flipped through the copies I had brought and whistled low. This is textbook coercion wrapped in family love. Your parents funneled the money through a joint account they still control. I can trace the bribes in the donor arrangement. But you need to understand something, Stella. If we push back hard, they will fight dirty. They already have your sister and probably your husband half convinced you are the unstable one. I left that meeting with a plan forming, but my phone buzzed before I even reached the car. A text from my mother. Doctor called. Another appointment tomorrow. We will be there to make sure everything is handled correctly. Don't make this difficult. The message ended with 3 heart emojis that somehow felt like a threat. I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel until my knuckles went white. The private coercion had started years ago, but it was accelerating now. My parents were not going to stop until they owned every piece of my life, including the child I was carrying. And I was starting to realize that fighting them might cost me more than I had ever imagined. I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel until my knuckles went white. The private coercion had started years ago, but it was accelerating now. My parents were not going to stop until they owned every piece of my life, including the child I was carrying. And I was starting to realize that fighting them might cost me more than I had ever imagined. I drove straight to the coffee shop where Violet Thompson was already waiting with her laptop open. She had pulled an extra chair so we could sit side by side away from the windows. Stella. I ran the numbers you gave me last night, she said without preamble. Your parents transferred $38,000 in 3 installments through a shell account they control with your sister. The donor they chose wasn't random. He's a distant cousin on your father's side, someone they could pressure later if needed. This wasn't about the baby's health. It was about locking you into their version of family control forever. My chest tightened. I slid the hospital folder across the table. Violet scanned it and let out a low whistle. This is enough for a civil suit right now, maybe even criminal if the clinic cooperates. But here's the part that's going to sting. Your husband Brandon met with your mother 2 weeks before the bleeding scare. I have phone records showing they spoke for 43 minutes. He didn't switch any samples himself, but he didn't stop them either. The words hit harder than I expected. Brandon had been distant lately, blaming work stress, but this. I asked Violet what my next move should be. She leaned in, voice steady. Document everything. Don't sign a single paper. I'll reach out to the clinic quietly through a contact. But you need to prepare for pushback. Your parents have already started telling people you're overwhelmed and need their guidance. That narrative spreads fast in a place like Wichita. I left the meeting with a flash drive of everything she had compiled and a plan to meet my Uncle Mason again that evening. When I got home, Brandon was in the kitchen making coffee, his back to me. I told him what Violet had found. He set the mug down slowly and turned around. Your mother said it was just to protect the trust for the baby. I thought if I pushed back, they'd cut us off completely. Stella, we can't raise this kid on my salary alone. The inheritance is our safety net. His words landed like another slap. I stared at him, the man I had married 7 years ago, thinking we were building something real. You knew they were playing God with our IVF, and you said nothing. He opened his mouth, but I cut him off. Don't. Just don't. I walked out of the room before he could answer, locking myself in the half-finished nursery again. The baby kicked hard, as if reminding me who this fight was really for. My phone rang an hour later. It was my mother. I answered on speaker so I could keep packing a small overnight bag just in case. Stella, we need you at the house tonight. She said, her tone already laced with that familiar edge of disappointment. Your father and I have the lawyer Grayson King coming over. He's bringing the updated trust documents. We're doing this as a family, no more delays. I told her I was exhausted from the hospital and needed rest. She laughed once short and sharp. Inzari, exhausted. You're 34 years old and still acting like a teenager who can't handle responsibility. We raised you better than this, or at least we tried. I heard my father in the background, then his voice rising for the first time in years. Martha, she just got out of the hospital. Give her 1 night. It wasn't much, but it was the first time I had ever heard him push back in the moment, instead of waiting until later to smooth things over privately. My mother didn't miss a beat. "Walter, stay out of this. You always coddle her, and look where it's gotten us. Stella, if you're not here by 7, we will come to you. And we will bring your sister Ivy so she can explain exactly how much this is hurting the whole family." The call ended with a click that echoed in my ears. I sat on the edge of the crib we had bought months ago and felt the walls of my own house closing in. My mother had just threatened to show up at my door with reinforcements, treating me like I was still the unreliable daughter who needed managing. The fact that my father had spoken up at all felt like a crack in their united front, but I knew it wouldn't last. He always folded when it mattered. Uncle Mason arrived right after dark carrying takeout he knew I liked. We sat at the kitchen table and I showed him everything Violet had given me. His face hardened as he read the donor records. "Your mother called me again this afternoon bragging about how they secured the future." I told her she crossed a line. She hung up on me. "Stella, I love my sister, but she has always seen you as the one who needs fixing. This isn't love. This is control." He offered to go with me to the lawyer meeting the next day as a witness. I agreed, but my stomach was in knots. Before he left, he paused at the door. "One more thing. Your sister Ivy has been texting me trying to get me on their side. She said if you don't sign, they might have to reconsider who the primary beneficiary is after the baby comes. They're already planning contingencies." The threat hung in the air long after he drove away. I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling while Brandon slept on the couch downstairs. Every time the baby moved, I felt a fresh wave of determination mixed with pure terror. My parents had turned my pregnancy into their leverage, and now they were tightening the noose with lawyers and family pressure. The next morning, my mother texted again, this time with a photo of the trust papers already printed and waiting. 7 o'clock sharp. Don't make us wait. I forwarded it to Violet and asked her to meet us at the lawyer's office instead of the house. She replied instantly, "I'll be there. Bring every document you have. This could get ugly fast." I drove to the office alone, heart pounding. Grayson King's waiting room smelled like fresh coffee and old leather. My parents were already there, my mother in the center chair like she owned the place. My father stood behind her, arms crossed, jaw set in a way I hadn't seen before. My sister Ivy sat beside my mother, scrolling her phone. The moment I walked in, my mother stood up and delivered the first blow. "You're late. Again. Always making everything about you, Stella. We've been patient for 7 years of this marriage, and now you're dragging a baby into your mess. Sign these papers or we will have no choice but to protect the inheritance from your poor decisions." Ivy looked up and added her own cut. "Mom's right. You've never been good with money. The trust needs proper management." My father didn't laugh or change the subject this time. Instead, he stepped forward, voice low, but edged with real frustration. "Enough, both of you. Stella has a right to hear the full picture before she decides anything." It was the closest he had ever come to taking my side openly, and for a second, the room went still. My mother turned on him with a look that could slice glass. "Walter, if you keep undermining me, we will have this conversation at home later. Stella already knows what she owes this family." She slid the papers across the table toward me. "Sign, or the next bleeding scare might not have such a happy ending. Stress is dangerous in the 3rd trimester." Remember, the threat was so casual, it took my breath away. Before I could respond, the door opened and Violet Thompson walked in carrying her own folder. "Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Fisher. I'm here as Stella's advisor. We have some questions about the $38,000 that moved through your accounts last month." My mother's face didn't change, but her eyes narrowed in a way that promised war. Violet laid out copies of the bank transfers and clinic emails right there on the table. My sister Ivy's phone slipped from her hand and clattered to the floor. My father's shoulders dropped, the quiet anger from earlier shifting into something heavier, like he was finally seeing the full weight of what they had done. My mother recovered, first her voice ice cold. "This is a family matter. You have no right to interfere." Violet didn't flinch. "Actually, I do. Stella is my client and these actions constitute fraud. We can settle this quietly, or we can let the authorities sort it out." The room went dead silent. I felt the baby kick again, hard, like a reminder that I wasn't alone in this fight anymore. My mother leaned across the table, eyes locked on mine, and delivered the final jab in that sweet, venomous tone she saved for moments like this. You would really drag your own parents through the mud just to prove you're independent. After everything we did to give you this life, fine. But remember, Stella, once you start this war, the baby will be the one who pays the price. We have resources you don't. She stood up, motioned for my father and sister to follow, and headed for the door. My father paused just long enough to look back at me. His face wasn't tense with discomfort this time. It was something closer to regret mixed with resolve. "We'll talk tonight, just you and me," he said quietly before they left. I sank into the chair, document still spread out in front of me. Violet put a hand on my shoulder. "That was round one. They're not backing down, but neither are we." My phone buzzed on the table, a new text from my mother sent from the parking lot. "Your father just told me he's meeting you alone later. Don't forget who raised you, and don't forget what we can still take away." The message sat there, glowing 3 little heart emojis at the end again. I stared at it until the screen went dark, realizing the private war had just gone fully public inside our family. Whatever happened in the next 24 hours would decide whether I kept any part of my life or lost it all to the people who were supposed to love me most. I stared at the phone until the screen went dark. My heart was racing, but my mind felt strangely clear for the first time in months. I drove home slowly through the quiet Wichita streets and found my husband waiting on the porch, looking like he had not slept in days. Before I could even get out of the car, my sister called. "Mom is furious," my sister said the moment I answered. "She says you are turning this family against each other. You need to fix this tonight or the baby will suffer the consequences." I hung up without giving her the satisfaction of a reply and went inside. Later that evening, my father showed up alone as he had promised. He sat at the kitchen table and for once did not try to laugh it off or change the subject. His voice came out low and heavy with something I had never heard from him before. "I tried to slow her down, Stella, but your mother has been planning this since your grandmother passed. She sees the trust as hers to manage because she knows better. I should have stopped it years ago." Then he leaned forward, jaw tight with quiet anger, and added an edge I had never seen directed at her. "But if you fight her publicly, it will destroy what is left of this family. The baby needs stability, not a war. Choose carefully, my daughter. She will not back down, and neither will your sister. They already talked to the clinic again today." It was the most direct he had ever been. No awkward laugh, no quick exit from the room. The quiet anger in his eyes lingered like he was finally tasting the weight of all the years he had stayed silent. He stayed at the table for another hour, telling me details I had never known, how my mother had involved my sister in picking the donor to keep the bloodline under their watch. When he left, he paused at the door and said he would try one more conversation with my mother alone that night. I believed him in that moment. The next morning brought a fresh escalation. My mother called the doctor directly and arranged a follow-up appointment without telling me. When I walked into the clinic waiting room, my mother and my sister were already there. "We are here to support you," my mother said with that calm, venomous sweetness she saved for these moments. "The doctor agrees that stress is bad for the pregnancy. Sign the limited power of attorney for the trust decisions and we can all relax. It is only for medical and education expenses, Stella. You are making this harder than it has to be." Violet Thompson was waiting in the hallway and slipped in beside me. The doctor. Hazel Rogers looked exhausted when she pulled me aside. "Your parents threatened to switch clinics and file complaints if I did not cooperate with their narrative." "I am sorry, Stella. This has gone too far." My father sat in the corner of the exam room the whole time, arms folded, his face showing a new kind of resignation mixed with private regret. He did not interrupt my mother once, but later when she stepped out, he whispered to me, "I told her last night this was wrong. She said if I sided with you, she would make sure the family knew I was the one who failed everyone." My sister added her own sharp jab while we waited for the paperwork. "You have always been the difficult one, Stella. Mom only wants what is best and you keep fighting it. The baby deserves better than your stubbornness." The words landed exactly where they were meant to, reminding me how long they had painted me as the problem. After 3 hours of back and forth with my mother's voice never rising, but every sentence carrying that psychological cut about how I was risking the baby's health and the family's future, I made the painful choice. To protect the pregnancy from more stress and the constant threats of legal and medical interference, I signed the limited agreement giving my parents control over the trust for medical and education expenses only. It was not full surrender, but it was enough to give them a permanent foothold. My husband sat through the whole meeting and afterward told me quietly in the car that he could not live with the constant tension anymore. He packed a bag that night and moved out saying he needed to think about what was practical for the baby. The baby was born healthy 2 months later, but the isolation settled in fast. My sister cut contact completely, telling mutual friends I had betrayed the family. My father tried one last private conversation a week after the birth, his voice breaking with regret, as he admitted he had failed to stand up fully, but he ultimately stayed with my mother. My mother sent a single text the day I brought the baby home. "We will be involved whether you like it or not. This is what family does." 3 heart emojis at the end again. I moved to a small apartment on the other side of Wichita with the little savings I had left after the partial trust arrangement. The days were quiet and heavy. I learned that sometimes the only way to protect your child is to accept the painful loss of the family you thought you had. My parents kept their grip on part of the future I had imagined, and I carried the weight of the compromise every single day. True family, I realized, is not always the one you are born into. Sometimes it is the one you build alone when the people who raised you refuse to let you go. Thank you for listening to my story. If you have ever had to make a heartbreaking compromise with your parents to protect your own child, tell me in the comments what you chose and how it changed you. It helps knowing I am not alone.